Appreciate you sharing a bit of background there of how this search, as we like to call it here, got started. And to transition into the book, though, you say early on that thinking is about attitudes as well as techniques. What do you mean here?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important point, actually, because when people think about critical thinking, and a lot of critical thinking books and texts do focus on techniques, how to construct a valid argument, and they tell you about syllogisms and fallacies to avoid. It does make it sound like it's technical. It sounds like it's something you could teach to a computer, and maybe some of it you could. But, when you look time and again and look at who are the good thinkers, who are the not so good thinkers, there is this phenomenon of the very smart think person, but the person who's really just always trying to win the argument. They're always trying to prove how clever they are. They're always trying to defend whatever view they have. And I've met a lot of people like this, and they're very, very clever, sometimes, fiercely so. But, I don't think that their being clever means that they're onto the right thing, because they're not putting it in the service of the right things. So I think you've got to start with these. Sincerity is one of the key things. So Bernard Williams wrote about this idea in his last book. Bernard Williams was a 20th century British philosopher, a very well-known one, and he wrote a book called Truth and Truthfulness, in which he talked about virtues of truth. And one of his two virtues was sincerity. You've got to really sincerely want to get to the truth. And that sounds obvious. Most people would say that's of course what they want, but actually you got to work on that sincerity, because there are so many sort of prejudices, biases, prior views getting in the way. And I think that, if you can get your attitudes right, I think a lot of the other things about right thinking sort of follow from that.
In this context, how do you see an attitude connecting or maybe not connecting to something like a core view and belief, or something similar to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, when it comes to core beliefs, I mean, I think it's always the case that you always have to have some fundamental beliefs that you go along with. I mean, you can question everything at some point, but if you question like the very existence of the external world, or your own sanity, I mean, you then have to get on with things, and you may not have a proof that the world is out there, or you're not mad, but you have to sort of get on regardless. But the kind of beliefs which have to be bedrock really should be minimal. They should be the ones that thinking would be impossible without. And I think that that's a real challenge, because a lot of the time we take to be fundamental beliefs which aren't of that kind. They're more substantive. They're about. Let's take an example, a sort of a general worldview. So I would generally say that I was a naturalist, right? Meaning that I think the natural world is all that there is, and there isn't any kind of supernatural world or dimension. And of course, that's, if we start thinking about what do you mean by natural, that gets complicated. Sure, I understand that. But, and I kind of took it to be that some of my philosophical heroes, like, David Hume, were also kind of naturalists. And I think they were, but I think it is a way in which they were there was a kind of agnosticism in there, really. It wasn't that they were firmly committed to the naturalistic view. It's just that they felt that you had to assume a natural world in order to make sense of anything. You didn't have to assume the existence of anything else, and we didn't really have any very good reasons to think to believe in anything else. So, naturalism becomes a default mode of doing things, but it shouldn't be a kind of a dogma. Oh God, I'm not going to countenance the idea that anything that doesn't fit the natural world doesn't exist. It becomes a methodological thing. So even when it comes to those very general worldviews, you don't want to commit yourself to more than you have to commit yourself to. You want minimal commitments, really, because you need to make minimal assumptions, I think.
You write, or early in the book, maybe it's in that first chapter, that thinking like a philosopher is no simple task. Maybe we shouldn't think about it in the way of, life hacks, or maybe that connects to techniques that we were just talking about. But are there a couple reasons that might come to mind, as obviously there's many, but maybe a couple of why this is a challenging thing to do?
I think it's challenging. Well, one reason goes back to the attitudes thing. If you, when you look at like what textbooks say about the fundamentals of good reasoning, from a logical point of view, actually, a lot of them, they're fairly obvious. They're not difficult from that point of view, right? So what does it mean for a valid to be an argument to be valid? It's for the conclusion to be to necessarily follow from the premises. And if you set things out formally, it's not too difficult to see that. But in practice, in the context of the world, we seem to be amazingly poor at sort of like spotting when things are indeed valid or not valid, sound and not sound, whatever it might be. So a lot of the techniques aren't that difficult. So a lot of the hard work comes because I don't like to sort of appeal too much to these kind of evolutionary type explanations, but it's kind of evidently true that we haven't evolved to primarily be rational, logical thinkers, abstract thinkers. We've evolved to be good at practical problem solving, working things out together, and so forth. And we particularly, it seems, haven't evolved to be able to think very well by ourselves, which is perhaps a point we'd come to later. We do seem to think better when we're in dialogue with others. So one reason why it's such an effort to think well is that our route is littered with temptations for shortcuts, assumptions, things which will reassure us, and so forth. And it's so hard to avoid all of those things. So that's why it really, I think, that's sort of the key reason, I think, why it's a real effort.